Well, up next, we are going to discuss the topic of the race of the superpowers, U.S. versus China. And this is definitely another global issue that's in the air that we had to talk about at this conference. We have a remarkable panel assembled here. And first up on that panel, we have partner at 8 Roads, Mr. Joe Chang. We have builder and investor at Ant Financial Alibaba, Mr. Riddhiman Das, and a terrific moderator for this panel, the founder of TechNode, Dr. Gang Liu. So a round of applause for our next panel.
Good afternoon, guys. Maybe we just start with really quick self-introductions. I'm Gang Liu. I run TechNode and also TechCrunch China. So we pretty much with Chinese tech for a long times. So that's just for me. So I think I'll leave the rest of the times with our 2 great panelists. Maybe we start with Joe, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Chang. I'm a partner with 8 Roads, based in Shanghai. And I co-lead our technology fund in China. 8 Roads is actually the proprietary venture capital arm of Fidelity International. We have offices across Europe, Asia, including Southeast Asia, in Singapore. Collectively, with our affiliated funds, including F Prime Capital in the US, we have over $6 billion in AUM, which puts us, I think, somewhere in the top 10 globally amongst pure VCs. In China, we actually are one of the oldest VCs. We started doing venture investing in the 1990s with the Series A investments in Asia Info, Series A investment in Alibaba. And we're right now on our 6th and 7th vintages in China.
Thank you, Joe. Please, Das.
Hi, I am Riddhiman Das. I am a tech guy first and an investor second. So before this, I did a startup called iVerify. What we did was we built software to look at your eyes, the human eyeball, and identify you uniquely. That company was bought by Alibaba, rather Ant Financial, and I came as part of that deal. So now I'm an investor focused on technology investments for Ant Financial. What that means is I look for investments in 5 key areas as they relate to enabling technologies for financial services. Those 5 areas are blockchain, AI, security, IoT, and computing. And I spend a lot of my time on sourcing these deals in Israel and everything west of Israel. So lots of time in Eastern Europe, less and less time in the United States, but everywhere else.
Okay, we'll find out why. Okay, so I know probably the most, it might be the most difficult panel I ever moderated, because I know everybody want to talk about, want to hear from us, how we saw like China, US, blah, blah. But like all the questions are really sensitive. So I think we're going to give it a try, right? So let's be straight on this, because I was in London last week, in a panel. The panel, I think the subject is about like China, the next powerhouse. The next week in KL, Malaysia, is another panel is talking about China as like tech power as well. So obviously, I think people see Chinese kind of technology ecosystem is booming. We see more and more Chinese companies, they are doing well in China. Also, they are doing relatively well in global stage. And so I think that's why we have more and more conversation about Chinese and people focus on Chinese technologies. But of course, because the China-US war, I think the topic become more sensitive. But I think, as I said, like maybe just be straight on this. I think my first questions, if allowed, is I really want to hear from you what's kind of you always thought, like the China-US kind of tech war. So what's your view on this?
Sure. Right now, things are unclear, and there is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of rhetoric, and there is very little policy guidance that we have seen so far. So I think there is a deal in progress. Hopefully, there will be something, and we look forward to that. At the moment, it's causing a lot of uncertainty in where we can place bids and how we can work across borders. Specifically, a lot of those restrictions happen in the form of CFIUS and export control, right? Which we're waiting to see how those will evolve. They are in a total state of flux. The common perception seems to be that this is a trend that will happen, that will continue to happen after the current administration in the U.S. And that's frustrating, but at the same time, we are optimistic that at least a clearer path will emerge ahead.
Right. So actually, the answer is unclear.
That's correct.
Right. So how about you, Joe?
I think same answer. Look, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. Certainly, that provides some challenges, I think, across the board for everyone. But I think as a venture capitalist, we are in for the long term. So, you have some short-term challenges, but in the case of investments in China and China technology, we're still very bullish. We are very high on the innovation wave that's underway in China. We think that was happening, before any of this happens. And if there's something to be taken away from the trade war, I think it will only accelerate technology innovation, not just in China, but I think also in the U.S. as well. And so for VCs like us, we're very excited about that, actually, because we're all about the innovation. And in a way, this will end up being, a good opportunity for us.
Yeah, I think, so last year around September, there was an Eric Schmidt quote, which was really popular in the media, right? And I think the quote was that the internet was going to splinter into the Eastern internet led by China and the Western internet probably led by the United States. I think what some of these trade tensions are doing is accelerating the pace of that division, right? We are already seeing technology leaders emerge in China that are very China-centric, looking to grow in areas where China has geopolitical influence. Similarly, we see American companies moving a certain, potentially different direction, moving to countries where the United States has political influence. So we also see that in blockchain specifically, right? So a lot of people think that blockchain is going to be this technology that unveils Web 3.0, right? And there's a lot of fluff there, there's a lot of real stuff there. But if there does happen to be a blockchain-led Web 3.0, I think it's going to look like a Chinese Web 3.0 or an Asian-led Web 3.0 and an American-led Web 3.0. Similar but vastly different implementations of the same technology and incompatible potentially.
So can I take that as, so maybe if you talk about China-US war is unclear, but you too feel like a positive. I mean, if we talk about like a startup, I mean, you said like maybe they're going to accelerate the innovation in China, also like outside in global as well, right? Okay, maybe we can talk about we can leave that for like a later discussion. Just want to get a little bit deep into still kind of war related, because every time we talk about war, of course we talk about like Huawei, but I don't think it's because we have heard lots of discussion about Huawei, but I think what's behind that, because actually from technology point of view, because I think everybody think like 5G is like a core technologies. I think that's why people are so interested in Huawei, right? So why you think 5G is so important, like to China, to US, maybe to the global industry as well?
So I think 5G is a great example of the type of technology that gets us as VCs really excited, because 5G is going to enable things that you don't see today in terms of speed, in terms of network bandwidth. And so many of the things, if you go back, say, 10, 15 years when the internet came about, it completely changed the way that almost anything was done. Okay? And I think we're at a period in time where you have a number of different technologies, not just 5G, but anything related to data right now is extremely interesting. And this is also ties back to why we're very excited about China as a source of innovation, where I'm not sure you're ever going to get away from a global sort of ecosystem completely. Yes, there will be, some tensions, but at the end of the day, consumers, customers, no matter where they're at, they're always going to want to have access to the best technologies, to the best experiences. And if you look at what's happening in data today, there's no place in the world where you have larger scale of data than in China, okay? And the issue today in data and in IT, for instance, is that just like the internet back in the 1990s, the existing or legacy IT infrastructure was not equipped to deal with what the internet needed from a performance standpoint. And so you had companies like Cisco, become startups because the incumbents didn't know how to do routers or switches, right? And so we're seeing now another stage of disruption and innovation coming because of the scale of data. Data is doubling every year, okay? And so we're really at the beginning of this. And so if you look at all the technology, all the IT that exists today, it's not equipped to deal with what you need, right? In terms of scalability, in terms of performance. And if you look further, where is a lot of that innovation going to come from? Sure, it's going to come from places like Israel and from Silicon Valley, but increasingly it's going to be coming from China, because this is where the data scale is. You've got dozens of companies who are generating 5 petabytes of data per day. Okay? We have seen entrepreneurs come to China specifically to set up companies to get close to Toutiao, to get close to JD, to get close to Ant Financial, right? Because this is where the challenge is first. And so to develop their products, they have to be where the customers are, where the challenges are. And so we're very, very bullish on that. I'll give you an example. We have investment in a company called Killigence, which basically was started by the team in Shanghai for eBay. They built an open source product called Apache Chiling, which basically they did it because they looked around, they couldn't find anything to deal with what they needed to do, which was to process billions of rows of data, massive data sets at sub-second latency. So they went ahead and built that product, right? And eventually, they open sourced it. Thousands of companies were actually beginning to use it. But then there were a lot of companies that were saying, hey, how do I use this? How do I do this and land it in my enterprise, particularly in China? Because many of these companies that have these large data sets, they don't have the resources of the FANGs, right, to go and try to deal with it themselves. And so they look to this team to say, hey, can you, help build stuff for us? And so they came out, built a company, and decided to productize it, and through some augmented AI features around it to help you predict queries and essentially enable you to process these massive data sets very, very quickly and connect it to easy-to-use BI tools, including Tableau, Power BI, as well as Microsoft Excel. So just make it very, very easy for these folks, right? And so that's the type of innovation you're going to see, as an example.
I'm particularly bullish on 5G as well, and I think it's going to enable a whole new set of use cases that have had bottlenecks hold us back today. So one of the investment areas that I focus on is IoT, right? And when I think about IoT, when we think about IoT, oftentimes we're looking at it with applications in new retail, right? Which is how do you bring the smartness of the online retail experience to offline retail, the legacy retail experience. And as we think about IoT there, it's a lot of sensors, right? It's the sensors to determine where the user might be walking, where merchandise might be, how to do checkout payments or checkout registers and all of that kind of stuff. And there is a big challenge there today in terms of all of those devices needing to be connected to a central point of connectivity, and it's just a painful process, right? And as we look to scale that, technologies like 5G and everything else that comes along with it really leads itself to a better experience for the end user and the customer, right? It is very likely, given so if you look at previous waves of similar technologies, there have been different standards that emerge from different parts of the world. Like if you look at 1G, quote unquote, you saw CDMA, Code Division Multiplexing Access, and GSM emerge from the United States and Europe, respectively. It may very well be the case that in this kind of environment we live today, that there may be parallel approaches to the standards come from both China and the United States this time. So there's a lot of excitement, which is genuine, which will lead to some interesting and more creative use cases. There's also some of the standards and some of the implementation details we're still finding out.
Okay, so we talk about like China, US. Do you think that this type of situation has some impact on Asia or Southeast Asia?
Well, I think for one, the fact that what's going on is impacting, between China and the U.S. You're actually seeing, I think, an acceleration of a trend that we've already seen, which is both capital as well as talent headed in this direction in Southeast Asia, from China. And so, in fact, we're invested in at least a couple of companies that are headed by Chinese teams based in Shenzhen or Beijing. One of them we're co-invested with Ant Financial, an Indonesian hybrid e-commerce and consumer lending platform called Akalaku. This is a Chinese team that has Indonesian ties, and if you look at the cap table, it has been largely Chinese investors, right? But I think this is a good thing, for Southeast Asia. I think some of the earlier investors have talked about, the large market here. That's definitely an attractive area, for any company that's looking to expand globally. Now, Southeast Asia, I think, is definitely a target for many of the Chinese companies, some of our portfolios. And with that, they're going to be able to bring their know-how, their capability to help, both entrepreneurs as well as consumers, realize better experiences here and, and deliver, value here in ways that are just going to be accelerated.
So you think there's going to be more and more like South Asia portfolios for Chinese VCs or co-invested by Chinese VCs?
Well, I think that's already happening. For us, we have a Singapore office here. We have a China office. We work together on these sorts of cases because we've got boots on the ground to work in both areas. And so for us, it's exciting because our global platform, I think, is really distinctively positioned to help entrepreneurs and companies navigate across both of these regions, India as well, and even ultimately, if you have a Southeast Asia, portfolio that gets large enough and wants to go expand into the U.S. or Europe, that platform will serve us well.
Yeah, I think if you look at a lot of countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia, they're starting to look more similar in user behavior to Chinese and East Asian users than they are to American users, right? A major part of that has been the leapfrogging that has happened in the last 10 years, right? Smartphones are bringing about hundreds of millions of people online for the first time, right? As opposed to what you saw in the West was people were being brought online by desktops first and then laptops and then those kinds of different modalities of interacting with online services, right? So that presents an interesting opportunity for mobile-first services to come out of China rather than the United States, I think, because end users are more comfortable in emerging economies of Southeast Asia and South Asia in interacting purely from a mobile standpoint. Sorry. Sorry about that. I didn't realize I was speaking far away. So I was talking about user behavior being similar in Southeast and South Asia to China, right? And that presents an opportunity for Chinese tech startups and technologies to make a dent in the region. From everything related to chat messaging to mobile payments to online banking is done mobile first in these economies rather than desktop and laptop first. And we see today that a lot of American consumers still prefer to bank on their laptops or their desktops, right? And that's not so much the case as in the countries of Southeast Asia and South Asia. So we're incredibly bullish on those trends continuing and those countries going through a similar growth spurt as China did in the last 30 years.
Right. So actually, you two actually all original from States. right? But how long you been in China?
I've been in China since 1995,
Wow,
so
okay.
quite a while.
Right. Yeah. How about you?
So when we were a startup, I worked in China quite a bit. So starting
Right.
in 2011, I have worked with Chinese companies and Chinese customers. Most of them were bigger OEMs of phones and device manufacturers early on. And then we were bought by a Chinese company, and then
Right.
I've been working for a Chinese company still based out of the United States.
Okay, just talking about like technology itself, it's nothing to do with like politics and So what impressed you most in the past maybe 3 or 5 years in the Chinese tech ecosystems? Because everybody talking about China, why some people think China, the technology is really booming up and they're going to kind of conquer the world. What impressed you most?
Sure. So in the areas of technology that I look for investments in, it is clear that China is a contender to be a leader in all of those categories, right? If you look at blockchain, there is a lot of innovation coming out of China, right? And there are certain challenges in the Chinese market and the Chinese regulatory structure, like for example, China is not particularly friendly to cryptocurrencies. And a lot of people assume that blockchain and cryptocurrency go together, which is what we are trying to prove, that that's not necessarily the case. You can have a blockchain and have all the benefits of distributed decentralized execution and data storage without necessarily using a cryptocurrency. In AI, we're starting to, China surpassed the US in AI patents recently, and there's a lot of work being done around explainable AI and all these things that are emerging to make automated credit decisions all the way to automated risk and fraud decisions and all of that. And there are still challenges. These technologies, as they become more mainstream and they come out into the Western world, we need to gain the trust of the end users and the companies that we work with in the Western world. But it is clear that China has a very, very talented workforce that is highly educated and extremely hardworking, right?
996.
996, that's correct. And yeah, we do 855 and we're lazy and China's
007.
Right.
007.
Right.
Okay. Sorry.
Well, I think that one of the things I'm very impressed with are companies like Ant Financial, Alibaba, just around the business models. But I think that's been talked about, time and time again. I'll go back to the area I mentioned earlier, which is around the data. Okay. I think when you look at something like AI, for instance, China is really in an advantageous position amongst a number of different dimensions. You have a country, for instance, where in autonomous vehicles, for instance, there is an outfit coming out of MIT, the Roost Labs, who basically are able to set up shop in Suzhou. Okay, and the reason that happened was because the founders, weren't determined to set up anything necessarily even in China, but Suzhou wanted them to come, right? And so they asked, what can I get, right? And the response is, what do you need? Well, I need a dedicated lane, okay, on your roads for my cars, okay? Done, right? So something like that's never going to happen, in some other geographies. But another example, again, in autonomous vehicles, we're investing in a company called Pony AI. Which actually straddles, between the U.S. and China. And I've actually our team has sat in cars in both Fremont, California, where they do some test driving, as well as in Guangzhou, China. Okay, and I can tell you, having sat in the car in Fremont, it's like driving Miss Daisy. It's not a whole lot of interventions needed. Very smooth driving. A little bit boring, to be honest. I don't know, no offense to anyone who's from Fremont, California. Guangzhou at 5 p.m. at dusk is a totally different situation in rush hour, okay, with ulama delivery guys cutting you off, people jaywalking, right? And so if you look at Pony, even though that there's other AV companies that probably have more miles, driven, the quality of those miles, in terms of training the algorithms, and the algorithm itself ends up, I think, in my view, being of higher quality because of that environment. And so that's, the other aspect of this is just, again, the large data sets that are unmatched. When you look at AI, everyone says data is king. And right now, the data right now is in China.
And we're seeing similar trends in other industries as well, in addition to driverless vehicles. For example, for a long time, the long-standing assumption in biometrics was that facial biometrics will never get to a point where you can use it reliably, right? And we've seen two companies get there, right? Face++ and SenseTime. And the only companies that have gotten there at the moment seem to be Chinese companies or Asian companies, right? And largely because of the amount of data, the training data that has been available to them, that they have been able to train their algorithms to perform better in these scenarios, right? We still see things like Google's facial recognition DeepNet and Facebook's DeepNet, but they were used mostly for social media and tagging operations, not higher risky situations like payments and banking situations. So the larger and larger amounts of data being generated by Chinese consumers, I think, is a major advantage to Chinese tech ecosystem.
So how do we foresee sort of like the communications or connection between China with Asia or Southeast Asia? So you're going to see more Chinese companies, come to use their technology that apply to the Southeast Asia local market. So that be the trend, or maybe vice versa. Maybe because I don't know what's your opinion. Do you think more and more like Southeast Asia startups or companies, they have opportunities back in China and to do Chinese business as well?
Absolutely. I think, so the case in point, say, for example, one of our, the companies we've invested in Singapore called VKey, right? What VKey makes is a piece of technology to provide secure execution capabilities on a phone that doesn't have a secure chip, right? So a lot of smartphones today have a secure execution chip where you can run sensitive operations, right? But what happens in the case of the hundreds of millions of people in the region that have cheap $20 to $80 Android phones that don't come with these secure chips, right? VKey has been a successful integration use case for us because we've managed to integrate their technology into a lot of the wallets we have in the region, tremendously increasing the amount of security we can offer in those situations, right? And it's a Singapore-based startup that we're using the technology worldwide. In addition to that, we're doing several strategic partnerships and global partnerships with local fintech players in the region. We've got investments all the way from Pakistan to India, Bangladesh, obviously Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Korea, and those are going extremely well because we are exporting battle-tested technology from Alipay into these wallets and greatly expanding the scope of services that they can offer at scale.
I go back to the point that I made earlier, which is I think customers and consumers will always gravitate to superior technology, superior offerings, and so as long as you have companies wherever they may be, if they're in Southeast Asia, that deliver those superior experiences or that superior offering, I think customers and consumers in China and anywhere else will be very accepting of that. Speaking from the other direction, I can tell you that many of our portfolios, as they get China locked down and talk about global expansion, Southeast Asia is often very much the first step. I think it's a natural first step because number one, it's the closest, and I think secondly, there are a lot of China folks that are networked across the region. The culture is a little bit, I would say, more similar than, say, Europe or, the US. And so for many of the Chinese companies, I think it's the natural, first, stepping point for expansion.
Yeah, probably my last question, because some people think, China will be a powerhouse in the technology space. Because I don't know, I'm not quite sure, but I'm pretty sure it's like Asia. In general, Asia will be the powerhouse. For the global tech industry. So we've been talking about some kind of the bright side of the Chinese technology or Asian market. But maybe my last question is: do you think there's anything missing in Chinese tech ecosystem or in Asia tech ecosystems? So basically, it's what do we still need to really catch up? From US or from Silicon Valleys.
Sure. So, as I've observed, a lot of Chinese products make its way to the West and to non-Chinese markets. I see oftentimes they're lacking in tailoring the experience to the local user, right? And to the local customs and preferences in that region. That manifests itself sometimes in poor translation issues or assuming a pattern of behavior where that doesn't fit with the local population. For example, let's just say the difference between WeChat and WhatsApp in India, right? WeChat made a big push to go into India, so did WhatsApp around the same time, right? And what happened was WeChat took a lot longer to send photos and video, whereas WhatsApp was compressing it prior and sending it to the end Indian user. It felt like WhatsApp was a lot faster when actually it was just downsampling the photos and videos before sending them out, right? Which is a clear example of WhatsApp being able to tailor-make its product to the local population in India, and WeChat assuming China has great bandwidth, great network connectivity, and India at the time didn't have those things.
Right.
Yeah, I actually think I would tend to agree. I think one of the biggest challenges for Chinese companies, rather than the deep tech itself, I think is being able to navigate local cultures. It's one thing to develop something in a market like China, but then when you land it anywhere, and this goes for any geography, including U.S. companies going to China or going anywhere else. But I think one of the challenges that we've seen with some Chinese companies is that they try to sort of just bring their China-only sort of focus. Then they lose sight of what the local customer needs, and so that's why when you look at even the two companies that I mentioned earlier, you're dealing with teams that are from China, but they also have a very deep-rooted local team or even local backgrounds, right? So for instance, the founder of the other company that we're invested in is a company called Silot, which is helping to do payments for financial institutions. And the founder actually, and the team is from Baidu, but the CEO is actually, he grew up in Thailand, right? So he's very familiar with the culture. He basically calls Thailand home. So you've got to have, I think, that sort of cross-border capability in your thinking, in your teams, and how to deal with your customers as well.
Right. We still have a little bit, well, I don't know, it's over time, but okay, we need to get a very short answer because Techsauce is for startups. A lot of startups here come to Techsauce. So because you both sit as the kind of investor, so if you look at startups, what's the most important kind of factors for you to make an investment? Right. Can you share just very quickly, when you look at the startups, you look at...
Yeah, that's a great question. As Ant Financial, we're often purely looking at a startup from strategic perspective, right? We're not looking at it to make a financial return, but we're looking at how they fit within, say, our growth journey, as well as can we be a strategic partner for them and be their partner in Asian markets, right? So we look for signs that the company is ready to go after companies at China scale. Which is one of the major factors. Second to that, we look for innovativeness of the technology. Oftentimes, that is interesting algorithms or patents or intellectual property of some other sort that we do not have in-house. Oftentimes, in our case, an investment comes with a joint partnership opportunity or a cooperation opportunity to go to market. And I think Alibaba or Ant Financial would be a great company to be a partner with for early stage startups in the Chinese market. So it's a win-win situation for a lot of these companies.
Okay, thank you. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, you have the standard VC answer to that, the size of the opportunity, why are these guys going to win? Because of the differentiation, the technology, the barriers of entry. But I think absolutely the most important thing, at least for me, is the team. Okay, because the team is who you're investing in. That team, you can have the best idea in the world, but if you don't have a team that can execute it and get it to fruition, then you've really got nothing. I would also say that, time and time again, in some of our biggest hits, actually, the original plan ends up not being anything like where you end up, right? So, Alibaba being one of them, when we invested, they were a B2B platform, right? But that's not where the value was ultimately created. And so you're looking at teams that have that ability to persevere, to be resilient, to pivot, and be very, very attuned to, how the market changes, because it's going to change. And your plan, what you have in mind almost always is going to change. And so that team for us is always the most important thing.
Okay, thank you so much. So please, if you want to know more about China, about like investment or tech ecosystem, please come to these two gentlemen after the off stage. Of course, if you want to read more about China, please come to Techno. Okay, so please help me to give a round of applause to the two great speakers, and thanks a lot for their sharing.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, guys.